It's funny. I used to follow Peter Zeihan a little while ago because he comments on things that I don't really know too much about, such as international demographics. But eventually, he started to make some extensive commentary on things that I do have some knowledge of, and it really cast doubt, at least in my eyes, on pretty much everything else that he is saying. I forget what the name of that phenomenon is, but basically it's the idea that you could read, for instance, a newspaper such as the New York Times or anything else that is written by professionals, by experts, that sort of thing. Even if you trust some of that commentary or all that commentary, eventually there's going to be an article on some niche, right, or some area of knowledge that you happen to know a lot about. Let's say that you are a climate expert or study some niche subject that most people don't know too much about. You will, of course, find information in any newspaper that is just flat out wrong. And I am in Russian Telegram channels. I follow some Russian news. I understand, for instance, that you have to be very careful looking at all of that. But as we'll see in this video that he did on the Wagner coup or the simulated coup, however you want to term it, there's actually a lot of information that you have to be skeptical of when it comes out of the West as well. And the total lack of information that is kind of used almost as a I don't know, it's kind of like a defense mechanism or a shield, right? It's kind of funny because he put up these videos pretty much as soon as all this was started happening. And yet within like 2 hours of posting them, they became totally defunct. So let's just take a look at what he's saying, and not even just kind of like the specifics and the details, but kind of just like categorically, what are the strategies that he's kind of using with his viewers? He kind of has this kind of like thing that he does where he wants to play it both ways. Let's just see what the strategies that he's employing with his followers, because if you read actually some of the comments to his videos, they're clearly being driven into a very specific kind of path, right? He's not really teaching them to think critically. He's just kind of cultivating these lapdogs, and we're going to go through some of that in a little bit. But let's just go through this video. I have it at 1.25 speed in case he's a little bit faster than what you expect.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Marshalltown, Iowa. This is my old middle school behind me. I was trying to mind my own business and have some personal time and attend a birthday party here in my hometown, but apparently there's a coup going on in Russia, so no rest for the wicked.
And I mean, this is the crazy part. So he's going to a birthday party. Maybe it's a kind of like semi-reunion at his old middle school. Yeah, like I'm positive that, you know, he's a red-blooded American male. I'm positive when he was a middle schooler that he had some girl in the classroom that he had a crush on. And now he's coming back 30, 40 years later as a total superhero with 500,000 subscribers, an international name, probably millions of dollars to his name. And I'm sure there might have been some of these girls that he had a crush on. And now they are perfectly buxom MILFs. And he could have had a great time with them, but he just couldn't stop himself. He had to get out of this event. He had to go outside. He had to put up a video that 2 hours later was already going to be defunct, right? I mean, with some people, I have no idea what they're thinking.
Short version, it was over the course of the 23rd, 24th, and 25th, a guy by the name of Prigozhin, who is the leader of the Wagner paramilitary group, who has been an unofficial arm of the Russian military now for several years, has launched an arm in its direction. His troops...
By the way, just keep in mind what he just said, right? He called him Prigozhin. I don't know if he talked about Wagner on this channel before, but you know, I'm not one of these people that would ever correct somebody for mispronouncing a Russian name, right, in the Russian way. Like if I'm speaking to an American, right, I'm going to say Nabokov, right? If I'm talking about the author Vladimir Nabokov, I'm not going to say Nabokov, right? Because I just find that sort of thing totally insufferable, right? The American pronunciation and the English pronunciation is Nabokov. That's just what it is. However, right, he is a geopolitical analyst. He, of course, reads tons of stuff that is transliterated from other languages. Given that that's the case, he should certainly be aware, and I'm sure that he is aware, that ZH in international transliteration is a zh sound, which is incidentally the same letter that exists in Russian, right? But he calls him Prigozhin.
have left their positions in Ukraine, They have moved into Russia proper. They have captured the city of Rostov-on-Don, which has a population of about 1 million. They're attempting to flip Russian troops to their sides. And the Russian government, Vladimir Putin himself, has declared Prigozhin to be a traitor and has called upon the military and security services to crush him. Prigozhin has said that the president is misinformed, but it's okay because we're going to have a new president soon anyway.
I mean, he's smugly giggling like a little girl. And the fascinating thing about this is he's literally like eating crow 2 hours after this video goes live. He skips out on an event with people that he probably has not seen maybe for many years, just to put up a video so he could laugh like a little girl, only to essentially be dunked on by everybody on the internet 2 hours later. And, you know, it's one of these things where it doesn't really matter how wrong you are, right? If you have a sufficient number of followers, if you could be charismatic enough, you're going to just get, right, this kind of phenomenon where you keep failing ever higher, ever higher, ever higher.
Someone who very vividly remembers duck and cover drills and is very aware that the Russians have been aiming nuclear weapons at us my entire life, there's something just deeply hilarious about this.
Well, it's also the converse is true just as well, right? We have also been aiming nuclear weapons at Russia our entire lives too, right? For as long as we've had nuclear weapons. This is actually how the Cuban Missile Crisis started.
The trick here is to not blow anything too much out of proportion because there's a lot we don't know.
So he's saying, let's not blow too much out of proportion because there's a lot that we don't know. And yet, despite this fact, he's going to go on the most sort of like extreme contingencies that always seem to end with the collapse of Russia.
So let's start with what is certain. Rostov-on-Don is the primary logistical and communications point for the Russian military in the entirety of the Ukrainian war. So first and foremost, the Ukrainians are making a lot of popcorn here and are getting very serious about their counteroffensive. Now, until this point, at least until the 23rd, the counteroffensive was not going particularly well. In any battle where the Ukrainians are facing off against the Russians, and the Russians only lose 3 times as many troops as the Ukrainians do, that's a battle that the Ukrainians have lost. They're at a huge material and demographic disadvantage.
I'm not sure if he's in fact suggesting that Russians are losing 3 times as many troops as Ukrainians. I know that at some point last year he said something like there are 500,000 people. I'm not sure if this was like in reference to Ukrainians, if this was in reference to Russians, if this was in reference to civilians or all together. But his claim was something like 500,000 people have been dead thus far in the Russia-Ukraine war. Maybe I'm misquoting something. Maybe I misunderstood something at some point. This was a video from a long time ago. Maybe fans of Peter Zeihan could either better explain it or justify that kind of commentary. But it seems very unlikely to me that Russia is losing 3 times as many soldiers as Ukrainians are.
And they just haven't been able to achieve breakthrough. There are multiple lines of defenses that the Russians have built over recent months. It starts with minefields, and as you get further back, it's anti-tank barriers and trenches. And for the most part, the Ukrainians haven't been able to get through the minefields. So I don't want to call it a failed offensive. I don't want to call it a stalled offensive. But it's definitely not been going as much as well as they'd hoped.
Well, it's a stalled offensive somewhat in the sense that originally Russia's offensive stalled, right? When originally, I mean, the plan was to decapitate the regime. It was not to occupy Ukraine, right? You're not going to occupy a country of 40 million with 180,000 soldiers. That's never going to be on the cards. And that stalled, obviously. And so far, the counteroffensive on the part of Ukraine has stalled as well. So let's not actually sugarcoat this.
But on the 23rd, we saw 2 things. Number one, a change in military strategy. The Ukrainians had gone from targeting command and control bunkers to targeting ammo dumps, which is something you usually do before a big push. And the Chughar Bridge in Crimea was hit by a few missiles to make the rail system completely impassable until repairs are done. Now, the Russians do have the technical capacity to do that, but it's going to be something that takes weeks, which means that there was this window in western Ukraine where the Russians in the western half of the front, from Melitopol west, were not able to function. And that provides an opportunity for Ukrainian forces. Now, I'm going to put all of that together now in a video from something that I was originally planning on posting before the coup started. So here's the Ukrainian section of that, and then we'll come back to the Russian section. We're now well into the 3rd week of the conflict.
All right, so here's the crazy part, right? This is titled The Russia Coup Part 1, What the Hell is Going On? 30 seconds into the video, he essentially tells you there's no way they could really know what's going on. Let's not jump to conclusions, but I'm going to jump to conclusions. And like all this video, just let me like look at this. Right? He's not talking about the coup. He just said that. Right? He's giving you all this military stuff.
The entirety of the Southwestern Front and Crimea, because not only with its and routes.
I mean, where is it? The Russia coup part 1. Where is it?
Ukraine, the single most, we're able to take out one of those two. A lot of this is not land. This entire is just yellow arrow, the one further to the right, to the east. You're looking at the Chandar crossing. But it blew all the way through the concrete, blew all the way through the decades in progress. The question as to whether they can. Now, the Ukraine.
So, I mean, look, he's not actually respecting your time. I'm not sure if this video of his already appeared before in the channel, but he's just kind of like, what, doing a composite, not even presenting any new information, nothing that he could actually say. He's not being very respectful of his audience, and he's just essentially just doing this clickbait. But again, with enough followers, right, and with enough sort of like, you know, algorithmic juice, your video is going to get pushed, even if you're totally disrespecting your own audience and, you know, just again, cultivating lapdogs as opposed to anybody that's actually going to think critically about the information that you present. And ironically, all his smugness about, you know, Russian sources of information, I mean, even if all of that is obviously true, you're going to have to be skeptical of things that come out of Russia. On some level, just based on how this war was being treated, not only this kind of like, you know, I guess the day-to-day war front type stuff, but specifically on how all the research prior to 2008 on Russia, on NATO, all of that totally went out the window, right? You're not supposed to discuss in polite company things that were just kind of figured to be realities back then and to compare and contrast them with what the understanding is today. You're not supposed to go further back because what we were saying 15 years ago, 20 years ago is very different than what is being said today. And instead of like pulling out some of this information and sort of like trying to dissect, well, what are Russians saying, right? Let me sort of explore what's going on in some of these Russian Telegram groups. He can't actually do that for you, right? Because as far as I'm aware, again, if you're a Peter Zeihan fan and you know something I don't know, correct me, but it seems like he does not read Russian. He does not understand Russian, right? He does not speak Russian. So he's limited to like essentially he saw a headline somewhere, decided, got a notification on his phone, I mean, whatever, decided to pop out of this birthday party and essentially do this video, which again is just like he's literally popping out of this, not to present anything useful, but to do some clickbait for his business.
Back to the Russian side of things with the coup. Rostov-on-Don is the primary jumping off point for Russian forces into Crimea and the southern front. And as long as Rostov-on-Don is offline, it is impossible for any Russian forces anywhere in the Crimea or in occupied Ukraine to reinforce, to get more troops, to get equipment, to get fuel.
As long as Rostov-on-Don is offline. There was no indication, even as this was happening. Again, if you actually look through the Russian channels, which you're not supposed to do, right? It's all propaganda. But again, if you actually learn how to separate nuggets of truth from the bullshit that you're fed, this is true of American media, this is true of Russia. It may be more extreme in Russia, but it's the same set of skills you're going to have to cultivate everywhere. You would know that Rostov-on-Don was never offline, right? And you also knew that, yes, there were, you know, these soldiers that were coming back and Prigozhin coming back, of course he was being treated as a war hero, but the majority of the Wagner mercenaries and the majority of people anywhere, they were not for some sort of coup attempt against Putin. This was not ever really on the cards if you were just kind of paying attention live as all this was happening. But for you to actually do what I'm suggesting, you're going to have to not just think like I have to at any cost whatsoever, I have to like put out a video. You're going to have to be a little meditative about it. You're going to have to spend some time, take a couple of hours, go through the sources, and actually present something of substance and of value to your followers. And that takes effort. That is not something that's necessarily going to get pushed by the YouTube algorithm. But again, he's not, you know, he's not here really to push information. He's here to give you some spin and not actually really talk about the topic at hand.
So this is a beyond a golden opportunity for the Ukrainians to give the Russians a serious drubbing. The question is, how long will it last? While there have been many reports saying many things, there is no sign of direct large-scale fighting between Wagner forces and Russian forces at the moment. But the Wagner forces are definitely in command of the logistical train on which the entire Russian army in Ukraine depends. And in that sort of situation, wonderful opportunity for the Ukrainians. Okay, next chunk, we're going to go into some of the stuff that's going on in Russia proper.
All right, so zero information of video number 1. Let's see what's going on here. And I'll just compare and contrast what he's saying here with some of the information that I had, like literally as it was happening.
We're still here, same day. You're going to hear a lot of crazy stuff out of Russia over the next several hours and several days. You're going to hear.
And watch how he juices the algo, right? So it's like he puts up one video that has like no real information whatsoever, and he decides to at the same time put up another video literally 5 minutes long that's also going to be like equally without information, and he's going to do the same thing a third time, right? Not one, not two, but 3 videos are going to be defunct by the time that he gets his ass back inside the school.
Hear that Prigozhin is having conversations with military commanders. You're going to be hearing stories about military commanders flipping sides. You're going to be hearing about defections within Wagner itself, of people going the other direction. You're going to hear about assassination attempts on all sides. You're going to hear about the Chechens siding with Prigozhin and Wagner or against, or you're going to hear about them going home. You're going to hear about the Russians blowing up bridges on the way to Moscow so Wagner can't make it. You're going to hear about forces gathering along the way. You're going to be hearing about airstrikes on Prigozhin because Wagner is so terrifying that the Russian military doesn't want to engage. You're going to hear lots of stuff. Some of it will even be true. Most of it won't. The problem here is that we are in an information vacuum.
Literally nothing what he just said actually transpired, right? You're not hearing those bits of news. You actually heard all those bits of news. Like, that's the irony, right? He's saying it's going to be coming out of Russia. Much of it is not going to be true. Maybe some of it will be. We're in an information vacuum. If you actually look what was going on, either, on whether his videos or on Twitter, as all this was happening, all that stuff that he's accusing that Russia would be pushing, that information was actually being pushed by the West. They were the ones coming up with all kinds of scenarios, right? All kinds of what ifs, and not just what ifs, right? They were saying quite confidently, this is going to happen, that was going to happen, and it's all kind of like the usual suspects. All the people that are typically, on one side of this thing, right, they were the ones pushing these narratives. So again, this is not in any way justifying the kind of like state of information in Russia. I mean, as this was happening, there were many Russians that literally did not even know there was a coup attempt underway. If, like, I remember as this was happening, I listened to Russian propaganda radio fairly regularly. I was tuning in, I was listening to it, and for a long time, right, none of this was really mentioned. And then after even the coup was resolved, because, I mean, none of this actually looks good for Russia, right? So after things were resolved, they ceased all discussion of this completely. But again, just keep in mind that everything that he is accusing Russia of, this was being pushed at that same time by the West.
Or something worse, that it's been filled with misinformation. So a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, there is no free press in Russia. There hasn't been for 20 years. That was one of the first things that Putin did when he took over. He removed all the satirical shows, he removed all the news shows, he removed all the investigative shows, and it became basically a one-man government and a one-state propaganda system that has become more and more intense, especially since the onset of the Donbass war back in 2014.
I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to. If he's referring specifically to the state TV channels that are just kind of like mostly watched by Russian boomers and people in their 70s and 80s. Yeah, but when it comes to like other categories of information, like it's kind of interesting to see it, right? Because there's a kind of like controlled opposition that is happening. And oftentimes controlled opposition does spin out of control. Again, if you actually like want to spend some time, and even if it's like with subtitles, just like look at Russian television and the kinds of things that are said, I am often surprised because, of course, I am coming from a Western background. But at the same time, it's like when I am watching some of this, I am kind of surprised at what does come out from Russian TV. I sometimes think like, Shouldn't this guy be like in prison somewhere? Like, shouldn't this guy have been assassinated, right? Like, wouldn't Putin do X, Y, and Z? But it's one of those things where, as talented of a dictator as Putin has been, he's no Stalin. Things are going to happen in ways that you can't necessarily predict or expect.
So official news channels are limited, and any time a Westerner tries to get in there to do some reporting, the Russians tend to arrest them on drug or sedition charges. And in fact, you've got a number of high-level journalists that are in jail right now awaiting trial and or execution. So the normal methods of getting information are thin. Folks like me, especially since 2014, have really relied on Twitter because it's basically crowdsourced information. And there was always a battle between the Russian bots and the Russian trolls on one side and the people who were trying to get information out on the other. And when we got to the start of the war in February of last year, the bots and the trolls just went away because a lot of governments and a lot of institutions, including Twitter, did a big crackdown on Russian misinformation. But then Elon Musk took over the operation, and in the time since, he had the algorithm push down the relevance of anything involving Russia and Ukraine, so it's actually below things like vaccine misinformation and election misinformation in terms of what gets brought up to the top. He's banned or shadow banned a huge number of accounts that I used to depend upon for knowing on what's going on in Kiev and Moscow. And most importantly, he's allowed the bots and the trolls to come back in force. So there's easily 2, maybe even 3 times as many bots and trolls from Russia on Twitter today.
Also, this kind of like blanket designation of bots and trolls, I mean, obviously they exist, but when you look at some of the commentary, for instance, coming out of I don't know, like somebody like Michael McFaul, or even honestly, like Peter Zeihan with these 3 videos. I mean, this isn't Twitter, but these are 3 YouTube videos that are kind of like back to back that present no information, that tells you he's going to talk about one thing, does the complete opposite, tells you we have an information vacuum, and, you know, eventually concocts like a totally elaborate sort of thing that never actually comes to pass. You know, some of the stuff, like, I have to be honest, it does really feel like the equivalent of a troll farm, except it's from the West. And it's not going to be a troll farm in the sense that, you know, someone's getting paid essentially chump change to like do like, you know, shit in the basement somewhere. It's people that look like Zeihan, right? It's people that get actual money. It's people that actually have, you know, professional status. It's people that are, you know, of a class that get paid attention to.
Not just that these are sources of misinformation, they're not all on the same side in this coup. Some of them are vitally ultranationalist, and they tend to side with Prigozhin and Wagner. Others are clearly employees of the state. And so now Twitter has become...
How is this different than what happens day to day on American Twitter? I don't really understand what he's giggling about. And if they're not on the same side, how are they troll farms and bot farms? They're not, right? Could it be that some of these people genuinely believe the shit that they push? I mean, Zeihan totally believes the shit that he pushes. He goes out and he says things like, well, first, I mean, he presents himself as an expert on pretty much everything, but whenever the subject of climate change comes up, this is the fascinating thing. I've never heard him ever say, you know what, I don't really know enough about this to comment, except for climate change. He says, I don't know enough about this to really put this in my analysis. When you look back on his employment record, he's been involved in oil and energy groups. So that, you know, that's not the same thing as a Russian troll farm, but an oil group would have a set of beliefs. It would have a kind of like pay structure. If you're talented enough, you could really rise in the ranks. If you're charismatic enough, you could really, you know, get a YouTube channel with 500,000 subscribers. It's its own way of doing things, right? It's not the Russian way of doing things. It's not the Russian mode of propaganda, but it's the American mode of propaganda.
An utter shit show of these various factions, misinformation factions, trying to shout each other down about what's going on in Russia. I don't really believe any of them. And so confirmation...
Really? Because I believed what I needed to believe. And I had so much more information on this coup as it was happening than this guy does. Because he's waiting for something that's never going to come. He's waiting for confirmation, and that confirmation is going to look like 2 hours later this video is just totally defunct.
This sort of environment just takes forever because, you know, if you don't get live video, it's really hard to confirm if something's actually happening. And now we've got Elon and Putin and Prigozhin, all with their own narratives about what's going on, and keeping track of it is just going to be a nightmare. Now, this will sort out over the next several days as the reality of events on the
Next
ground
several hours
takes the propaganda machine, and things are moving very quickly. And all of those things that I outlined at the beginning of it, those are all feasible outcomes.
We're almost done with this video.
At the same time.
He still didn't tell you anything about the coup. Second video. One video, what's going on in Russia with the coup, part 1. Part 2, you think he's going to actually get to it? No, he's just literally repeating what he said in the first video.
So, I will do my best to parse through them. I will try to lead with the things that I have confirmed, just like I did in the first video of this series. But it's going to be...
He didn't confirm anything in the first video of the series. The third video is not going to say anything either.
Really, really messy, and there's no way around that. One more thing about the propaganda side of this. While we have a good idea of which side the trolls are on and which side the bots are on, there's all of Russia's disinformation channels internationally that are all of a sudden up in the air. So, like, what's going to happen to Hungary's Viktor Orban, who has basically become a pro-Russian shill within the European Union? Is he in favor of Putin holding on to control, or does he like a more militaristic Russia because it would be more of a foil to be used in the European Union?
I mean, he's literally implying that Orban would prefer, perhaps, that Prigozhin would take over Russia. Like, this is, like, I'm sorry, this is the equivalent of a Russian troll farm. This is not a realistic appraisal of the dynamics in that situation. No, actual, there, almost nobody that's high up at all, went on Prigozhin's side. That didn't happen. The public did not go on his side. The soldiers did not go on his side. Right? None of this actually transpired.
What about people like Tucker Carlson, who have gone in hook, line, and sinker with the Putin side of things, now that you have more of a nationalist firebrand who we might find more ideological attractive than Prigozhin? What about people like RFK Jr., who have recently become on the Russian dole, or old-timer folks like Jill Stein of the...
What is the Russian dole? You think that guy needs money from Russia? He has more money than you, Peter. He has way more money than you do. He does not need to be on anybody's dole. He could believe whatever the fuck he wants to believe, and he could say whatever he wants to say. There's actually no rhyme, no reason, right? I can't even sort of pin down ideologically who JFK is, other than, I did a whole video on this if you guys are interested, but it's just that isn't that the equivalent of Russian disinformation?
The Green Party, all of these commitments that the Russians have cultivated very carefully over the last decade are all of a sudden completely up in the air, and we just don't know how it is all going to fall.
Guys, listen, if I ever start doing some shit like this, if I ever split up a video that is 20 minutes long, that presents zero information, into 3 videos just to juice the algorithm, do me a favor, just unsubscribe. I deserve to have 0 followers if I start doing some shit like that.
Okay, video number 3 on the ongoing coup/revolution in Russia. Let's talk about Wagner. Now, according to Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner, they've got 25,000 troops, and they've been able to attract a few defecting units from the Russian general military. We don't know if that is true. One of the things to remember about Wagner is it gets its troops from 2 sources. Source number 1 are Russian veterans, particularly people from some of the higher ranks, special forces, Oman troops, Spetsnaz, that sort of thing. They tend to be relatively competent, and so Wagner generally has the best troops and the best logistical capacity within the Russian system. What they don't have is their own hardware. They rely upon the Ministry of Defense for their equipment, for their armor, and their air defense, and they have no air assets at all. No helicopters, no jets. So if you see reports of airstrikes on Wagner, especially if they start moving up to Moscow, you should take those reports very seriously, because if you were Putin, that's how you would cut them up. Let them get out into the exposed on a 10-hour drive to Moscow.
He's literally, he's talking about a 10-hour drive to Moscow. He's talking about marching up to Moscow. He's talking about airstrikes in Moscow. Remember, he said information vacuum. We have to be very careful. We don't have access to this. We don't have access to that. He's already at the point of regime change.
And just start blowing them all on the road. As we know, if you take out the front echelon and the back echelon, the rest of them just kind of scramble in a death pile in the middle. That is a very realistic way of how this can all end, which, unless Prigozhin is completely stupid, wouldn't do it. But remember, this is a guy who is a convicted thief and former caterer. He is not a military super mastermind. Okay.
That part is true, right? He's not a military mastermind. I'm going to actually tell you guys something about Wagner and all this other stuff that he doesn't give you any information about. All the stuff that I actually knew as it was happening. So I'm going to supply to you the things that he's failing to supply.
Anyway, barring a complete collapse of the Russian military structure and political society, which you can't rule out, this is Russia, this has happened before. Prigozhin and Wagner really have no chance here. Small number of troops isolated in a specific part of the country, and while that might be hugely significant for the Ukraine war, they are just too far away from Moscow to make their voices heard in any meaningful, sorry, I phrased that wrong, not their voices heard, to make their desires reality. There's just too much space, too many Russians, and too much air power. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences here, even if this is a massively failed coup. Ukraine we've already talked about, but what about the rest of the world? Wagner, because it's one step removed from the Russian military, which is part of the problem, has been Putin's go-to tool for dealing with the international system for over a decade. And so almost all Russian military deployments around the world aren't actually regular Russian military. They're primarily Wagner. That's true in Syria, in Libya, in Sudan, in the Central African Republic, and on and on and on. And now the yes, oh my God, there's so many weird ways that this could have gone. This was definitely not one that was on my radar.
So this was not one way that it was on his radar. At least let me just give him credit for the third video where he's actually sort of saying something about the coup that was ongoing. He's correct in saying that they actually had no chance, right? I mean, as soon as I heard it, I heard it. What was it? It was the night before, and it was over by the next day. And the night before, I was like, I mean, whatever's going to happen, it's not actually going to turn out well for Prigozhin. I am surprised to hear this is, to him, surprising, because if you've actually been following what's been going on with Wagner for a long time now, one of the things that kind of shocked me at the beginning was, I mean, they were, formidable fighting force before the Russia-Ukraine war started, but pretty soon after it started, it ballooned to something like, I think at its peak, it was something like 50,000 soldiers. Now, Wagner technically is the reason why, like, Russia never really admitted it was really kind of like part of the Russian military is because, technically speaking, these sorts of groups, right, these like paramilitary and these PMCs, they're not supposed to exist, right? Anything outside of the Russian sort of like armed forces, they are actually illegal in Russia. But like many things in Russia, right, things could be legal or illegal, but how it plays out practically is different, right? Especially since Russia being like a state without necessarily a tremendous amount of state power, right, given just kind of like the realities of like, post-USSR, they just offloaded a lot of responsibility to the private sector. And when Putin came into office, one of his primary project, right, when he ran his election in the 90s, it was titled like the dictatorship of the law. The idea was Russia turned into a totally lawless society, and he was supposed to whip it into shape. He was supposed to either liquidate the oligarchs or to bring them to heel, right? And he would essentially be like the top mob boss in this kind of like overarching cartel. Now, as this was happening, as the Ukraine war was unfolding, and I was watching Wagner balloon to like 50,000 soldiers, I thought, this is exactly antithetical to what Putin did over 20 years ago. And I can't imagine that down the road this doesn't become a problem. It's especially supposed to be a problem if we have somewhat weak state power, right? Don't confuse the fact that Russia has a dictator with a strong state power. Russia is the world's largest country. It has obviously the longest border. It dealt with an insurgency in the 90s, and again with the Second Chechen War that Putin finally put to a close in the early 2000s. So at any given moment, there's always a possibility of some kind of insurrection happening, and it's obviously very difficult to move, over 1,000 miles from one point to the next, one flashpoint to the next flashpoint. So as all this was happening, and I was watching Wagner balloon, I definitely had the thought in my mind that this doesn't sound like a good idea, right? From the perspective of Putin, eventually there's going to have to be something that happens where Prigozhin essentially kind of like postures as the next oligarch. He wants to have more power because he's getting more power. He's having this sort of hero status that is, I mean, it's not more popular than Putin, but on some sort of like level, right? Even if it's just the kind of cult of personality, that's going to be a threat to Putin, right? This eventually is going to have to play out in a way that maybe there's not going to be a violent altercation, but I was not one of these people, unlike Zeihan, I guess. thinking that this is not on the cards. It definitely was on the cards if you at all pay attention to Russian history after the USSR.
But now that Wagner is persona non grata, every Russian military, every Russian military base around the world is going to get shut down by the Russians in the next few weeks. That, of course,
that didn't happen. I'm not even sure exactly what the reasoning there is, but I mean, does it even matter what the reasoning is? I mean, he has a conclusion that he needs to reach. Whatever sort of machinations and whatnot that leads to that, like we're gonna dance our way to that conclusion.
This assumes that countries who are trying to seek favor with Putin don't go against Russian forces at Putin's. Oh my God, this is just delicious. Okay. I
mean, doesn't this like sound a lot like election night 2016? I mean, like, I get it. You want a certain conclusion, but how blinded are you by your desires?
Yeah, I've got to get myself some popcorn for this. Okay, folks.
No, you got to get yourself back into that school of yours and find yourself that MILF.
The bottom line here is that Wagner's military capacity is a subset of Russian military capacity, but the personnel are different. And so now that the personnel have changed sides, you should expect to see...
The personnel did not change sides. Even as this was happening, there was not information indicating that. Even in this information vacuum, whatever limited sources that he was depending upon, they did not indicate this.
A complete disintegration of the entire Russian global position beyond the former Soviet Union.
You remember how this started. If we don't have enough information, we have to be very careful about our conclusions. Listen to what he just said.
Within the former Soviet Union, as a rule, it is the Russian military who is in the pole position. But beyond that, wherever it happens to be, it's Prigozhin and Wagner that are the face of Russian strategic foreign policy. And now that that's on the other side of a rebellion, that is going to completely die. Now, for those of you who have been worried about the long duration of Russian power, this is great, because remember, Wagner is the best troops that Russia has. It's the sum total, it's really the only place that Russian vets go to after they leave the regular military. And they are scattered around the world. They are vulnerable. They are now without supplies or fuel or diplomatic cover. They are enemies of the state.
Again, like even if you think that the coup would have some sort of limited success, which, by the way, he said the opposite, right? He says this is not going to turn out well for him, right? So congratulations for that assessment. This other conclusion that he's reaching totally has nothing to do with it. And of course, the fact is that's not even what he believes, and yet he still reaches this conclusion. It's just weird, isn't it? Isn't it just like weird to listen to?
It's going to be a wild week, folks. Oh, one more thing. Big question that we don't know the answer to. There are two sources of troops for Wagner, the military veterans and also convicts that they've pulled out of prison to use as cannon fodder. Now, convicts are good as cannon fodder for offensive operations, but they're not good for defensive operations. So, and they're probably not good for sending into, say, like a city like Moscow where there's regular Russian forces either. So basically, the convicts have become a non-issue in this. And so it really comes down to the rest of the troops. Wagner no longer has the ability to recruit. All they can do is try to flip Russian regular military units. That is their only source of troops. So Wagner absolutely has no staying power in this fight. The question is, what can they do in the very, very, very short term? They have access to the military stocks around Rostov, and that's it. So this is probably either going to be a mad dash to Moscow, which would be suicidal, or a protracted defense in Rostov to draw upon the stocks where they can actually defend. Regardless of which those options are, this is fantastic for the Ukrainians, because if it's option 2, defense of Rostov, then all of that equipment is no longer available for Russian troops in Ukraine at all. They make the mad dash for Moscow, then we have a very public, very global, very humiliating military rebellion in the heart of Russia, in which the Kremlin and Putin are the direct targets. I would expect them to win and win handily, but Russia will not recover from that sort of image. And from a tactical military point of view, if Prigozhin and Wagner are making a mad dash for Russia, then forces, the best forces that Russia has outside of Wagner, are in Ukraine. They're going to have to leave Ukraine in order to catch up with Wagner in order to defend the motherland.
So as this was happening, I just kind of like, I was in the Russian telegrams. I was trying to see what was going on. And one thing that immediately I realized, right, this was like, this information happened like the night before, right? So as it was happening, this kind of came to light that, I mean, this was reported on in the Russian news like the week before, but it wasn't necessarily like dwelled upon, right, until after the coup attempt. So Wagner originally wanted to sign a contract that would be like on favorable terms, I guess, to Wagner. And Putin, over the last like few months, right, but especially intensifying the last few weeks, you start noticing Prigozhin just kind of like totally just like freaking out more and more and more. And the reason why these freakouts are intensifying over the last few months is he was systematically getting fewer and fewer like shipments of ammunition, all of that, right? Because Putin was trying to box him out, right? He's trying to get Wagner out of the operation because they are growing. They were growing way too fast, way too much. And since that was the case, Putin was like, all right, we're going to slowly take over the operations in Ukraine. Wagner is going to play like a limited role, but we wanted to play like a larger role again internationally, as Peter Zeihan was alluding to. And of course, like Prigozhin, right, he has his own needs. He has his own desires. He wants to be the war hero. He wants to be the next oligarch. He wants to experience his own kind of cult of personality. And he starts freaking out progressively more and more. Surely Peter Zeihan, who is a geopolitical analyst, like, wouldn't he have access to this kind of information? I mean, I know it, and I don't consider myself an expert in any of this kind of stuff. I just happen to pay attention to some of this to some extent, and I can sort of like separate reality from bullshit fairly quickly. And to the extent that I think there's an interesting comment to make, I will make that comment. But this channel is not about geopolitics. It's not about Ukraine. It's not about Russia, right? It's not about my own Russian heritage. It's not anything about that. But I'm still able to provide this information to you. And he just didn't offer that. And specifically the week before the lead up to all this, Prigozhin wanted to sign a contract in favorable terms. Russia said, no, you will have to essentially do contracts directly with our armed forces. And this honestly is the thing that, there's many things leading up to it, but this was like the final straw for Prigozhin. This is the thing that is like the proximal cause for the coup attempt. He could have presented this information. I don't know if he doesn't know this information, because he is, again, like, throwing shade on any sort of like Russian sources of information. But if you don't pay attention to Russian sources of information, you probably did not know about the failed contract the week before the coup, right? I mean, like that would be a part of your analysis if you knew something about it. So he splits essentially one very, very thin on information video into 3, so he could triple his view count, so he could keep everybody both on this kind of carrot situation as well as on a leash. Right? I mean, like, look at these comments. Geopolitical chaos is my drug and Peter is my dealer. Business is booming. I mean, they're here for the drama, right? They're here for like essentially the street drama. After Prigozhin announced he is no longer continuing to march on Moscow, I desperately need a 4th part, right? I mean, they're just looking for that drama. And they're just looking for Zeihan to be this kind of guru-like figure. If he would have presented a kind of like structural critique of this was Russia in the 90s, this is how Putin would view any sort of like oligarchic encroachment as a threat, he could have presented this kind of like wider structural critique, but he failed to do so. If you have the structure in your brain, you don't need a Peter Zeihan, you don't need me, you don't need anybody to explain essentially the future to you. You could actually use your own brain to reach your own conclusions that could be separate from mine, that could be separate from Peter's, but these people are not looking for that. Right? And it's true what he's saying. Business is booming. This shit is all a business. YouTube is a business. It's nice to see Peter enjoying his work so much. Work I would put very much in scare quotes here, right? I'm not sure if I'd call this work. The real work would have been to actually lay some pipe, right? Because, he's an expert on energy. Imagine if he uses energy expertise to go to this middle school and lay some pipe on a MILF that he had a crush on years and years ago. That's what he needs to use his expertise on. The other thing that just kind of like was crazy to me that, like it was the like 500,000 casualties or whatever that he said half a year ago. But he started like commenting on other things as well. And I remember when he was on Joe Rogan sometime last fall or last winter. No, it must have been last fall because it happened around this time. He started also talking about the markets. Now, I'm not sure if he ever did, in fact, call out a trade. I'm not a Peter Zeihan follower. I only just kind of like briefly glance at his videos sometimes, and I haven't actually since the Russian coup stuff happened. But, you know, maybe followers could correct me here if I'm wrong, but has Peter Zeihan, who says, like, you know, I'm here to not only analyze geopolitics, but you see a lot of his followers who are like, you know, I use this information to trade. I use this information to invest. Has Peter Zeihan ever called out a trade publicly? Has he ever called out a trade? Because the only trade that I ever heard him call out was essentially telling Joe Rogan around this point that Bitcoin, this is the chart of Bitcoin, when it was at $17,000, he told Joe Rogan, it's at $17,000. Well, it has like another $18,000 left to go. No, it was $16,000. He said another $17,000 left to go. Essentially, he was predicting that it would be $1,000 liability to hold it past the 0 point. And Joe Rogan, you know, not that he's a critical thinker or anything, but he's been around like enough right wingers that he's sort of like absorbed some information about Bitcoin, and he just sort of, I guess, followed him in the past where he was just kind of skeptical. He was just like, really? Really? He wasn't pushing back or anything. He was just saying, really? Really? So Peter Zeihan told you guys at $16,000 that this thing was going to go to 0, then it's going to crash past 0 to $1,000. The government is going to charge you $1,000 for anybody that holds Bitcoin. Now it literally doubled, right? This is the only trade that I've seen this guy call out publicly. He told you to either get rid of Bitcoin, or honestly, the way that he was phrasing it, that's a very nice short, isn't it? It would be very nice to short 17,000 down to 0. That would have been a very profitable short, wouldn't it, if he was correct? If this thing would actually go to where it used to be, right, which is like this flat line, that would be a very valuable short. But I mean, even before even further, it's kind of like, it's just kind of crazy, isn't it? Like, just like, I mean, think about it. He's, I'm not sure if they're going to let me do this. They're going to tell me make a goddamn account. But like, I mean, even if you're not a trader or anything and you don't care about this kind of stuff, you just like open up a chart and you just sort of like, all right, there seems to be some sort of logic here. Since you know that this used to be important, right? This used to be important. This used to be important, right? We went up to here, we crashed. We tried to go up to here, didn't quite make it, crashed, right? This was the COVID low. This seems to be an important kind of point, isn't it, on this market structure? This does not seem like a good, like if you're like in any kind of coins, this isn't a great place to like sell everything. And that's the thing, like where was he when this shit was like at $69,000? I bet if I look at his Twitter feed, I'm not going to see any public calls for, all right, this is the top, go short. Because when things start going crazy like this, it's very, very scary, especially if you're on the opposite end. This is the only trade that I've seen him call out. Either sell everything or go short or don't buy, right? You either would have missed out on a 100% appreciation or you would have been liquidated for your net worth. Assuming that you're one of these people that leverages your net worth. But I mean, it's just you know, incredible. Like, again, I'm not gonna say that this guy is definitively a fraud, but he definitely has substantial hack qualities. Even the way that he sort of clickbaits into, you know, sort of like, you know, getting you to watch videos with information that is totally misleading, a total bait and switch. He gives you 12 minutes of military strategy from a previous video on a 14-minute video on the coup, right? Incredible stuff. So that's Peter Zeihan for you guys. You know, if this is interesting to you, maybe I'm gonna pay a little more attention to what he's doing. But honestly, these people are just kind of boring. Ultimately. I never want to be a channel that just does one thing, right? I'm never going to be just a geopolitical guy. I'm never just going to be, you know, one thing, right? Substantively, I want this to be the arts, but I have my tentacles, right? I have my tentacles in all kinds of little pockets, and maybe I'm going to start pickpocketing him. If he starts getting out of line, if he continues to be out of line this way, maybe I'm going to start staying on his ass a little bit. So we'll see. All right, thank you guys for watching. I'm gonna have some more stuff coming up soon.